Welcome to Music Crush, a new music podcast hosted by Flute New Music Consortium. I'm Elizabeth Robinson.
And I'm Nicole Reiner.
Hey, Music Crushers. A quick note from Elizabeth with her sound engineer hat on. We had a couple of technical difficulties in putting this episode together, and we just wanted to warn you before you dive in, the sound quality is not up to our usual standard. I think if you're able to get past the crackling and some of the sound issues, Cherise has some really amazing things to say. I know I personally enjoyed having this conversation with her, but if you're stopping by for the first time, or if you're like my husband and you're just a little bit more sensitive to static crackle, this might not be the episode for you. Either way, we hope you'll join us this time or next for another episode of Music Crush.
And announcing FNMC Presents, an album of previous commissions and competition winners performed by members of the Flute New Music Consortium. Repertoire includes works by Sean O'Pebolo, Joseph Hallman, Becca Sims, Cherise Leiter, and others. Purchase a copy today. All proceeds go directly to FNMC. Flute New Music Consortium, Inc. is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Your contributions are tax-deductible to the extent allowed by the law. Visit www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com for details.
We are here today to talk with Cherise Leiter. Originally from Florida, Cherise now lives in Colorado and is currently professor of music at Metropolitan State University of Denver, where she teaches music theory and composition. A composer with works for choir, piano, opera, voice, carillon, orchestra, and assorted chamber ensembles, her compositions have been performed in the U.S., Canada, Scotland, France, Italy, Romania, and Japan. Her works have been finalists in the Ithaca College 25th Annual Choral Composition Contest, the Outside the Box competition, and the Columbia Summer Winds 2016 Composition Contest. She has won the Braintree Neshoba Valley Chorale Choral Competition, the Ars Nova Composition Competition, and has been honored by the Boston Metro Opera. Her piece, The Life in a Day, for flute, guitar, and cello, won the Flute New Music Chamber Music Competition in 2017, and FNMC later commissioned her to write A Voice Silenced, A Voice Sings. Welcome, Cherise.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're really excited to talk to you today. We enjoyed The Life in the Day back in 2017, and we're busy digging into your new piece, which we're excited to share this year. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Oh, sure. As many things that happened in 2020, I blame it all on the pandemic. This piece, the Flute New Music commissioned this to be originally, I think it was going to be part of a new music festival, but all of that got canceled because of everything that went on, and so I'm really looking forward to having it premiered in, I think, February, right? I think it's in February that it's going to be on your recital, Elizabeth,
I am
right?
doing it in February. Is that the premiere?
That will be the premiere. That will be the premiere of this piece. So when I was first commissioned to write it, I had completely different ideas of what the piece was going to be about than what it turned out to be. So basically, it turned out to be a mashup of Hildegard of Bingen and Ella Fitzgerald. And again, I totally blame the pandemic for that sort of combination, because that is not where the piece originally was going to be. But during that whole time, I had, for some other reason, I can't remember why, I was really kind of diving into Hildegard, who had a fascinating personal life. If you've never read a biography about her, I strongly, strongly recommend it, because this should be a movie, this should be an opera, this should be everything. Her life was just insane. And I was listening to some of her music and was really kind of getting invested in that for something completely different that I can't remember right now. But I was listening to one of her pieces, and there was some motive in it, and I can't even find it anymore. So again, I'm blaming COVID brain. That was I'm like, this is a lick out of Ella Fitzgerald's one of her scat solos. And so that kind of started the idea of what would have happened if these two women had actually ever known each other, 700 years apart, but when you kind of dive into both of their personal lives, there really were some interesting trajectories between the two of them. things that they had in common in terms of challenges they faced and, really rough sort of personal things in their lives, but as well as this complete dedication and devotion to music. And that's something that really comes across in Hildegard of Bingen's biography, and also if you've ever read a biography of Ella Fitzgerald, she just was 100% devoted to music and to performing. And in a biography I have of Ella's, it actually said at the end of her life, her health was so bad that she really couldn't perform, but she was so convinced she needed to that her friends and managers would just tell her that the gig had been canceled to try to kind of keep her from trying to go. She was that sort of invested in it. And Hildegard at the end of her life had a very sort of traumatic event where she ticked off some people and they denied her the right to sing mass at her convent. And that was incredibly traumatic in the last year of her life. And so both of these women sort of had these really interesting similarities that as I started to work with this crazy idea, kind of became more and more clear to me. On top of that, the title actually came, usually my titles don't come first. I often struggle for titles. And this title, I'll have to say, came fairly quickly, at least the voice silenced part, which originally that's what it was going to be called, a voice silenced. Because again, both of these women had things in their lives that tried to silence them. And then also in 2020, it felt like, all of us who were musicians, who were performers or needed performers, everything was being silenced. I had the experience, and I think I've talked to a lot of my composition colleagues who sort of had a similar thing where 2020 started out like it was going to be one of the best years I'd ever had. I'd had 8 performances by March. I had commissions and projects out the door for the next couple of years. And then March 2020 happened and all of that kind of went, poof, very quickly. And it was very disconcerting in so many ways. And so that idea of just what happens when your voice, whether it's your literal voice or whether it's your artistic voice, gets silenced. But as I kept working with this piece, I was like, I can't, the title just can't be a voice silence. It's not about the voice being silenced. It's about the voice figuring out how to sing through that or after that. And so that's when the second half of the title came, a voice silenced, a voice sings. And it was always going to be sings, and I know this is flute, but it was always going to be sings because, again, it was based on voice pieces of both Hildegard and Ella Fitzgerald. And so the entire piece is sort of I guess you'd almost say a mashup of the two. It quotes from Hildegard's Ave Generosa, and then also from a couple of Ella Fitzgerald's different scat solos, one of the main ones being How High the Moon. And you can kind of hear, if you know those, now again, it's not direct quotes, but if you know those two pieces, you're like, oh yeah, I recognize that motive, kind of a thing. So it's more the style than literal I've always just been fascinated by the human voice. I am not a vocalist. That is not really one of my instruments. I do use it because I teach music theory. So of course I have to sight sing and everything like that. But I've always been fascinated by the human voice. I think it is the most remarkable instrument in many ways, because it's so different, person to person to person. On some level, a flute sounds like a flute, a trumpet sounds like a trumpet, a clarinet sounds like a clarinet. And yes, if you're really good in that instrument, you can sometimes tell the difference between two players, but you have to really be dedicated to the instrument to be able to tell that. But the human voice is just so distinct from person to person to person. I've always been fascinated by it. And so I do often make performers sing. And also this comes from the fact that I'm a flutist, but a bad one. But one of the few things I actually can do is sing and play. And so that's, of all the things, I can't play a scale of 120 to save my life, but I can sing and play. So, you work with what you get, right? So you maximize your strength. And so, there's a lot of asking the flutist to sing in this piece. Sing some jazz licks, sing some chant. And it's not about the quality of the voice or how attractive, quote unquote, attractive the voice is. It's just about using that very human that human connection that we all have in our voices and the distinct and different qualities that our voices have. That was a really long answer. Was that sort of what you're looking for, though?
That's amazing. I'm as we're doing more interviews with more composers, I'm learning about myself that the more story there is behind a piece, the more I like the piece. And obviously, I have really enjoyed digging into A Voice Silenced, A Voice Sings as we're approaching the performance that I have coming up. I think I know a fair amount about Hildegard of Bingen just from, being a classical music student for however many years, but I don't know a great deal about Ella Fitzgerald. And in fact, we talked about your piece in an earlier episode, and I had the wrong jazz singer entirely. I was thinking it was Billie Holiday, but it's Ella Fitzgerald. So anybody who listened to that previous episode, I'm sorry, I didn't lie on purpose. Do you have a favorite bio or a resource for folks like me who have some learning about Ella to do?
There was actually a special on her a number of years ago called Something to Live For. And I always remembered that. I watched it, I think, probably several times. And this was years ago, back when I think I was in college. And it was so fascinating and had such amazing things. She was a pioneer. And she and Billie Holiday, I think, were only a couple of years apart. I believe they were maybe 2 years apart.
They were contemporaries, so I felt a little better about confusing the two.
I want to say Billie Holiday was 2 years older than Ella Fitzgerald, but of course Ella outlived her significantly because Billie had such a short life. But it was Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, and Sarah Vaughan who were kind of like the trinity of jazz, female singers. And I did grow up in a household that really loved jazz. My dad is a jazz buff. And so I did grow up listening to a lot of those. And so Ella has always been in my psyche. And between the three singers, Billie, Ella, and Sarah, it kind of depends on what day I wake up and on what side of the bed as to who I prefer. But I would say that probably most of the time, Ella is going to be the one that kind of comes to the forefront. And the two songs that she has very famous scat solos for that are in this piece are I mentioned How High the Moon. Mm-hmm. And that actually I specifically took from her recording. It was an album called Ella Fitzgerald Live at Mr. Kelly's. And that was, I think, like 1958, although don't quote me on the date. And then the other one was All of Me, which is from a fantastic album that she did called Ella Swings Gently with Nelson. And Scat's version, the version she did of All of Me from that album is also those are the two that I took quotes from for the jazz passages in A Voice Silenced.
That's really awesome to know. I'm going to check those out, I think, when we get off of this conversation. Now, it's been a few years, but FNMC is also a huge fan of your piece, The Life in a Day. What can you tell us about that work?
Oh, that is going back in time, right? So that actually existed quite a few years before it even won the Flute New Music in 2017. And it was one of those where I think probably a lot of composers share this, that, the new piece is always the favorite back and you're on to something else. And so in 2016, one of my New Year's resolution was to go back and take care of some of my older children, and kind of see if I could get them back, sort of, back into the fold. And so Life in a Day had been composed, I think about 10 or even more years before that. It was actually commissioned by the Colorado State Music Teachers Association. I was their commissioned composer 1 year, and they kind of give you free reign of what to do other than chamber music, because it needs to be performed at their state conference. And so I don't even remember why I decided flute, cello, and classical guitar made sense at the time, but I have to say, it's still to this day one of my favorite combinations. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. And alto, I will admit, for a strong preference for alto flute. And so the flutist has to play both alto and C flute in this piece. But the title, The Life in a Day, is a play, of course, on a day in the life. And each of the three movements had to do with at the time of day. So the first movement was Dawn Fantasy, very, I guess sunrisey. I grew up in Florida, not that far from the beach, and I would often go over and see the sunrise on the beach because I was on the East Coast. So it very much, I had a very strong sort of mental association with that. The second movement was Workday Toccata, which was in 8/8. It alternated every other measure. So the first measure was 8/8, the next measure was 5/8, 8/8, 5/8 to 5, 8 to 5, 8 to 5, 8 to 5, right? This is kind of how my head works sometimes. I can't blame the pandemic for that at all. That was years before. And then the last movement was Evening Rhapsody, and kind of pulled it together. So it's 3 movements, and performed at their state conference. And then again, kind of, shelved after a while. And it's not a real common, chamber group. It's kind of hard to get all 3 together sometimes, especially kind of finding a classical guitar. Yeah. And so that kind of got shelved for a while, and then I dusted it back off for when I saw the chamber competition come up. I thought, I'll just give it a try. And now it's being performed again, which is super exciting.
Yeah, speaking of, flutist Krista Jobson just released her version of it for FNMC's new compilation album called FNMC Presents. I'm curious because, different people have different attitudes about this. Jennifer Higdon always insists on approving of everything before it gets released in a commercial recording. I think all of the composers we worked with for the FNMC compilation were really quite hands off with it. Did you communicate with Krista much, if at all, before she recorded that piece or during, or do you have a preference? Have you done that with other recordings?
I'm pretty much happy with whatever the performer wants to do. So I'm very happy to be hands-on if they want me. If they really don't want me involved, that's totally fine as well. So in that case, I knew it was happening. I knew it was getting recorded, but I didn't communicate with Krista about that particular performance at all, which was totally fine. Again, I kind of leave that up to the performers. It's sometimes I think it makes them feel more comfortable if they can ask me things. And then sometimes I think it can be scary to work, with a composer who's still alive, right? Once you're gone, you don't have to worry about them saying, oh no, that is not what I meant. But when they're alive and right there, there's maybe a little bit of added pressure about it. So I'm totally fine with whatever the performer prefers.
That's very generous of you. Do you ever, either in a recorded performance or in a live performance, not asking you to name names, but do you ever experience regret or, disappointment in what you're hearing, that somebody really hasn't gotten it? And if so, how do you deal with it?
Oh yeah, I think every composer does at some point, right? Because, it's first of all, the music is never, or I guess I should say almost never, what you hear in your head, as good as you hear in your head, right? Because in your head it's perfect, right? In your head it's the absolute perfect world. And so there's just that understanding that when it translates out of your head into other people, and even if it's yourself playing it, that it's just never going to be quite like it is in your head. And that's just a given, right? At least that's how I feel right off the bat. But usually most of the time I'm really pretty thrilled with what I hear, because even if it's not the same as in your head, it's live, right? And there's things that weren't in your head because you hadn't thought about it that the performer actually brings to the performance. And so I've actually had situations where I'm listening to a performance or a recording going, oh my gosh, that is better than what I thought I meant in my head,
Nice.
So as we were reviewing your catalog and getting to know some of your other works, I was really struck by the prevalence of Americana, or at least American themed inspirations. For our listeners, those include a few pieces with hymn tunes as references, shape note tunes as references. There are some cowboys. There's a little bit of Mark Twain, and obviously we just talked about Ella Fitzgerald. What about those topics attracts you, and what keeps bringing you back to those types of themes?
So, that's fascinating, because if you asked me if there was a theme sort of to a lot of my music, I never would have thought of that, right? But when you point it out, I'm going, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think I think it's probably two things at work there. I think there is a bit of the subconscious where I am very attracted to rural themes, to, space, land, nature. I always have been. My mom's family comes from a fairly long line of farm family, and I grew up going to my grandparents' farm, and now my aunt's sheep farm, and I love it there. I try to go back to the family farm, at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. And so there is definitely that kind of in my soul, but I never thought that it came out in my music really until you mentioned that. I'm like, oh yeah, I guess it does. Because the thing is that each of those pieces was not something that I necessarily chose initially myself. In other words, they were commissions for specific things. So a kind of the one that probably started it all was American Folk Suite, which is for flute and soprano. And then later I was commissioned to transcribe it for clarinet and soprano. But that was specifically a flutist asking me she was going on tour in Europe and wanted to bring some American folk music with her. And so asked for that kind of an idea. And so I sat down and started hunting out, folk songs that I kind of enjoyed or thought would be great for that setting. And so that kind of started that one. And then the Cowboy Songs was a commission from a soprano who wanted a piece to pair with Libby Larson's Calamity Jane, art songs on Calamity Jane. And so that started sort of that side of things. But then the Cowboy thing took over because and this is actually what happened a number of times. I get really into something and very curious about it and just have to explore it and find so much more material than I can possibly use in one piece. And so it just kind of keeps spilling over into other projects whenever I possibly can. So the Cowboy Songs for her was specifically, she wanted cowboy songs that were from a female perspective. And that's really hard to find. There are not that many out there that are kind of female oriented, right? It was a very sort of male world. But I found all of these amazing songs from the male perspective as I was going. And so Cowboy Songs for her then got the companion Cowboy Songs for him. And I found these things. I'm like, this is a duet. So then there's Cowboy Songs for them. And actually what wound up happening was we actually did a recital of all three sets kind of combined together as one 40-minute giant sort of cycle. And actually those are getting a performance here again in May out here, an organization called Art Song Colorado. So I'm really excited to hear that again. But in the researching all of the cowboy songs, I found Belle Starr, the female outlaw Belle Starr, and fell in love with her. And so then she wound up getting her own set of piano etudes. And someday her story has got to be an opera. And if there's any composers listening, I call dibs. So the Hands Off Belle Starr, that is my opera. Because again, she had this fascinating life, just, kind of a female outlaw, but incredibly intelligent, and then, gunned down before she was 42. So it just, that just sort of keeps, I get really curious about things, and then I just go for it. My head is just this mess of useless trivia, and it's entirely self-inflicted, but I just can't seem to stop myself. So one thing leads to another, and then you're right, a good chunk of my catalog is largely Americana.
It's good to have passions. I get really excited to talk to people who are really excited about something. And now I'm going to have to go check out Belle Starr. That sounds like my kind of story.
She's fantastic. She always rode side saddle because no matter how many people you're holding up and killing, you got to be a lady. And but she was an amazing shooter and married 3 times. And I mean, she had a life. She had a life.
If you ever find a way to incorporate her into a flute piece, you have at least one flutist in line to make that a reality. That sounds like my kind of deal. So you and I share a couple of acquaintances, and one of them recently mentioned that they were working on a recording project with you. When I warned you we were going to ask about that, you actually suggested a totally different recording project. What can you tell us about some of your upcoming recording projects?
Well, actually, I had a pretty exciting recording project this last year. There's a group, chamber ensemble called the Whistling Hens, which is a group consisting of a clarinet and soprano. So Natalie Groom on clarinet and Jennifer Piazza-Pick on soprano. And they are an amazing organization. Check them out if you haven't heard them before. Their mission is to promote women composers, female composers, many of them living, all throughout the ages, but many of them living, and they commission an incredible amount of work from us. And I was really fortunate to meet first Jennifer at a conference a number of years ago, and then through her the clarinetist Natalie, and they actually were the group that initially commissioned me to transcribe American Folk Suite from flute and soprano to clarinet and soprano, and perform that. And it worked out great. It has a completely different flavor, but it still, it just sounds different, but really, really cool. And then they commissioned me to write a piece specifically for them called Eve's Diary, which is actually Mark Twain, back to the Americana. Mark Twain, who is, I will admit, is a passion of mine. I loved his stuff from, a little kid. But he wrote basically a diary of Eve, so a fictitious diary of the first female, Eve, Adam's wife, from Eve's point of view, and it is hysterical. And then he actually went and wrote a diary of Adam and kind of put them together so that you're seeing the two sides of the same issue. And it's just brilliant. And so I fell in love with his portrayal of Eve. And so we set the first day when Eve is actually born, and called it Eve's Diary. And so that was written specifically for them. And then in 2021, they went into the recording studio and recorded an album called Reacting to the Landscape. And it's all female composers, some phenomenal pieces on there. And they actually did two of mine. So they did American Folk Suite and Eve's Diary. And it just came out a couple of months ago. It's fantastic. Go check it out if you get a chance. There's some amazing pieces on there and two of mine, and they did a fantastic job with them.
Another question that I really enjoy hearing composers' responses to is what's on your workbench right now? If you're able to tell us about any fun upcoming projects, or if you maybe have a dream project that's just waiting for the right collaborator.
Oh, goodness. I always have way more than I can actually handle. So actually working on right this second, as in literally right before we got together, and we'll go back to it as soon as we're done because the deadline is looming incredibly close, is a trio for soprano, violin, and piano. And it's a really fun project. There's a school here in Colorado called Parlando, which works with, young musicians, and they commission living composers to write pieces. It's such a fantastic idea, and I find myself so jealous that when I was, in middle school and high school, that I didn't have access to something like this. So I'm writing this trio for 3 girls who are middle school and high school, and it's going to be 5 short movements, and it's just super, super fun. I mean, I'm having a blast. I'm taking the texts from books that I grew up loving. Again, Americana. But it's, as you say this, oh man, now I'm going to have to actively go find something that's not for the next.
Or lean into it.
Yeah, or I might just have to, because as I think about the projects coming up, oh yeah, check the box, which I'm having a blast doing right now. And then also, again, back with the Whistling Hens, we have a project that we're in the talking stage about for April of 2024 that is for clarinet and soprano. And the text is drawn from a journal that my great grandmother kept. So it was found in the hayloft of my great grandfather's farm, and it's amazing the things she writes about, and there's this gorgeous letter in there to her husband after he passed. She basically in her journal wrote a letter to him a few months after he died, and there's references in the journal to my great grandfather when he was about 6, and it's phenomenal. She had such a very interesting way of looking at the world. So we're going to do some passages from that for an extended song cycle. And oh gosh, like dream projects.
We've got your cowboy opera for sure.
Yeah, that'll start, right? I've always wanted to write a concerto for flute and wind ensemble.
Oh, okay.
And I think that's probably up there at some point. So, anybody that's interested in something like that, let me know. Yeah, because it seems like I get a little, if I don't have a flute piece kind of on the radar, I start to get a little fussy. I've done a lot of flute stuff. I will admit I took a break last year and wrote a tuba quartet because I just needed low. But yeah, I guess if there's a dream project, I think that would be really fun to do something for flute and wind ensemble.
Cool. Great. Well, we'll keep that floating in the wind of possibilities for you.
Yeah. I have no clever segue to this, but I wanted to talk to you about your work at Metro State.
Oh, okay, sure.
So you, besides teaching composition, you teach theory, which most of our listeners probably know is required for all music majors.
Yeah.
Super, super important core classes to be a good musician, but sometimes it takes a while to win students over to that reality, right?
Yeah.
So what advice would you or do you give to your non-composer students, which is probably the majority of the class most of the time, to make the most of this crucial building block in their education?
Oh gosh. Usually I find that it completely turns them off if I try to give them advice. So
oh no.
Basically you try to just add your little pearls of wisdom in there in ways that they don't even know they're getting, right? I think what I mostly try to do over and over and over again is just show them how relevant it is to whatever they're working on. I think initially a lot of the resistance that students give you when you're teaching theory, and you're right, it's a core class, everyone has to take it. Right. It's kind of one of those bonding experiences that from the student point of view is you have, you're sort of bonded together in this loathing of this topic kind of a thing. And so it's an important rite of passage for students in music majors, but I just always start from day one, just trying to show them how relevant it is and where it is, and it's everywhere. And so I make sure we use examples from just about everything. I do always put one Bach example on every test because I tell them that, theory tests self-destruct if they don't have a Bach on them. But there's so many other things you can pull from. And so I just try to use a little bit of everything, whether it's current music that they're listening to, whether it's something that they themselves write. We do a lot of that. I make them you're right that most of them are not composers, but we do a lot of kind of composition projects, and then we perform them in class because it's always exciting for them to hear it. That kind of gets an immediate buy-in sort of a thing. But yeah, it's mostly just about proving to them that it's relevant and trying to spark that curiosity that I always felt when I was, learning something new. And I guess I would say that's one thing that I'm not sure when it changed or if it's going to come back or whatever, but it does seem like there isn't always that same curiosity about everything that I kind of experienced when I first started teaching from students. And so it seems like it's a little more work sometimes to spark that. There's a lot more of a practical, I think students are a bit more practical right now. They want to know how this affects them directly. How does it directly relate to them? How does it directly enhance, what they're working on at the time? And so I try to honor that, but I also, that wasn't me, and it still isn't me. I think you can probably tell my difficulty is reining in my curiosity, and reining in kind of how long I'm going to research something, which then takes me off to this, which then takes me off to that. And, pretty soon you've got 27 pages up on your computer because you've just gone down this rabbit hole. I mean, who needs to know how many times a minute hummingbird wings beat? But that's kind of where my head always goes if a question comes up. And so that sort of curiosity about anything, whether or not it directly affects you, is something that I don't find in my students as much as I used to, and something that I try to spark back if I can.
I mean, doesn't it? You've made some self-effacing jokes about this. I bet you're the life of the party at a dinner party, though. But I mean, isn't that true love? I mean, when you really go down that wormhole, I mean, it seems. If I look back at my 18-year-old self, how did I even know what was applicable to me? I mean, I was just so excited to be at college and just drink it all in because all of it was so new and stimulating. So yeah, that's interesting. And that was another question I was going to ask you because you've been at MSU for quite a while now. Is it 20-ish years?
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
Yep.
So maybe this sense of applicability is getting a little bit more pressing, as you mentioned. Are there other changes that you're seeing in your students' needs, either educationally or in terms of the professional advice that you give them now compared to when you first started?
Yeah, I have been there 20 years, and again, now we are an urban institution. We're right in the heart of downtown Denver, so we are not a residential campus. We're a commuter campus for the most part. There's a dorm, but it doesn't house that many compared to our student population, and so. So it's a little bit different than for the students that go away to college, right? They go for the dorm experience. They have the 100% they're away from home. A lot of our students still live at home or have their own homes. And so it's kind of a little bit different, but I guess I will say that one thing I have definitely noticed is that they are not coming in to the beginning of theory with the same background in theory that they used to. I mean, that is very noticeable. And so a lot more of them are taking like a fundamentals first, or I'm spending a lot of time in early on just drilling the basics that I didn't used to need to do quite so much, just things like key signatures or scales. And so that has definitely been a change. And I will say, though, that there was a huge change during the pandemic. I mean, we went to online teaching and then got back in the classroom, which was, I was so excited to be back in the classroom and have students that were three-dimensional again and see faces, even just half faces. But it was startling, the difference in the students coming in before the pandemic and after the pandemic. And I really found myself changing my teaching style drastically, doing a lot of putting drill exercises online and, just things like recording myself singing the sight singing examples from their books so that they could sing along with me to practice. And, lots of instructional videos, how to, the books, the textbook didn't seem to make as much sense to them. It was harder somehow for them to grasp from the textbook. And so I just, that was really startling to think that after teaching there for 18 years, all of a sudden I'm completely changing my teaching style, which was sort of unexpected, but also exciting on a number of levels. So I learned a lot of technology that I really didn't think I ever would. So that was a byproduct.
Your students are lucky that you put all that work into it. Do you have any theories about why they suddenly changed so much?
Oh, well, yeah. So I teach, I kind of teach a lot of theory 1 and theory 2. So the first year, it's kind of, I like it. I seek it out. I mean, let's face it, I don't really get excited over this is middle C and here's the lines and spaces anymore, but it's just such an important time to get them and to prove to them that it can be fun. And that's kind of maybe a little bit of my superpower is kind of getting those incoming ones and going, okay, you think this is scary. It's really not. We're going to have a lot of fun in this class. You're going to laugh. You don't think you are, but I promise you will. And, we have a really good time. And so I get them when they're first coming to college. So after the pandemic, when we were back in the classroom, day one, I expected it to be back like it was to normal, and it wasn't at all. And I finally had to realize that these students had basically had 2 years of online teaching, which was their junior and senior years of high school. And those years are so incredibly important just in becoming, developing the skills you'll need to go out and go keep going on in school, but also just becoming who you are. It's like they had missed 2 years of their life. And so even though they were chronologically 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, they weren't psychologically that age. And so when I figured that out and started kind of going, okay, well, let's kind of be a little more hands-on here, things smoothed out. And that's when I started, making all the videos and doing a lot more of, kind of reaching out and actively dragging people into office hours as opposed to just waiting for them to come kind of a thing, sort of speaking and not going, hey, office hours, I've got chocolate, but we're going to work on this. So, but I really think that those years in high school of online were just kind of stunting in a way in terms of their development as students, maybe not personally, but in terms of their development of students. And that's like just this theory that's not based on anything other than experience in the classroom. But I kind of think that might very well be a good part of it.
Kind of switching gears again, our last official question for all of our interviews is always, what are 3 pieces of music? Can be any type of music from any genre that you're listening to right now. Everyone always does that too.
Because you're a composer and you suddenly are on the spot. You're like, okay, I've got to think of something like deep or intellectual or that won't make me look like an idiot kind of a thing. And
or alternate strategy, just like lay it all out there and tell us what you're actually listening to, because I really want to know.
Oh gosh, okay.
Those are our favorite answers. Yeah.
So one of them has to be a genre. It can't be a specific. Well, I can give you a specific piece, I guess, but I've been jumping down the barbershop wormhole lately. Again, the whole curious thing that I can't quite control. So I have we have a BA in music theory at my school, and one of my graduating seniors last semester did his project. He wanted to do barbershop. And I had been exposed to barbershop as a kid. My dad loved barbershop, and we had some pretty good barbershop groups where I was growing up that I'd go to as a young kid, but it had been a long time. And so, he'd bring in these examples, we'd have to analyze them, and they are fantastic from an theory analysis point. I mean, the chords they use and the progressions that are not your traditional progressions, kind of a thing, and the invariant easy, and jumping down this barbershop wormhole again after all these years and loving every minute of it. So, and just kind of seeing how barbershop has changed. So I guess okay, if you wanted one piece, there's this fantastic group called the Sun Tones. They were really active in the 60s and the 70s. And they made several albums, and they did a song called Watch What Happens. And that is a fantastic arrangement. I think it was arranged by one of them actually for the quartet, which makes it, really personal. Yeah. So I guess I would say that if there was one, but that's kind of old school. They're very old school. And then if you're kind of into newer barbershop, there's the Newfangled Four, or, instant classic or mainstream. I mean, there's just so much. It's seriously, it's so fun. I can't stop. Okay, that's one. Okay. Now this one is kind of unexpected, I think, for people who know me, but 14 years ago, Alison Krauss and Robert Plant came out with an album called Raising Sand that fell in love with, even though I am really not a Robert Plant fan previous to that. And I mean, I knew who Alison Krauss was, but I can't say I'm a super fan. I appreciate what she's done and everything, and she's second in Grammy wins to Beyonce for females, which is amazing. But they came out with a new one last year called Raise the Roof. And I have just been, I'm on break now, so I have time, and it's amazing. Can't Let Go is maybe my favorite track off of that right now, although High and Lonesome, which Robert Plant actually wrote, is also really good. But there's just something about their voices that it's just amazing together, and the music that they choose is fantastic. So I think the first one won 6 Grammys, and this one's up for another 3, and I'm really hoping they get it. Okay, so that's 2. Oh gosh, see, this is what makes me just go, okay. So have you ever heard of Bardcore?
Yes.
Okay, so that's my other thing. A student actually introduced this to me a year or so ago, and she's like, "Have you ever? I think you'd love Bardcore. Have you ever heard of Bardcore?" I'm like, "No, I've never heard of Bardcore. What is this?" And so, it's basically pop tunes that are reimagined from a medieval standpoint. So there's so if you ever wanted to hear ABBA played on like lute and recorder, Bardcore is your thing. If you don't it in your life, I promise you need to stay in a line, play it on recorder and lute, because it's super fun. You cannot be depressed listening to this stuff. And so that's kind of the other thing that I've been spending a lot of time listening to.
Thank you for reminding me that existed. That was introduced by a theory student of mine a year or two ago, and it had disappeared from the edges of my memory, but now it's back, and I am grateful.
Enter Sandman with harpsichord. I mean, you just have to experience it to really see the joy that is found in Bardcore. So, yeah, that's kind of where I've been lately. Although I am on break, and so I blame that. But of course, there's amazing pieces out there, and I've been diving into a lot of the composers that were on the same album that I was on by Whistling Hens, and found some amazing, like Victoria Bond, who I'd never heard of, heard her stuff before, and I'm kind of she's kind of my recent composer crush, and so it's just there's so much out there that again it's a little overwhelming sometimes to explore it all, but I would have to say that, yeah, if you ask me the 3 most recent things that I've done, like today, I have listened to Barbershop, I have listened to a couple tracks from Raise the Roof, and I've listened to some Bardcore. So yeah, that was today's musical experience.
I am delighted that it is that varied. Thank you very much for sharing. Well, that wraps up all of our questions for you. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and for all of the information that you have shared. I'm personally really excited to perform one of your pieces. By the time this has aired, it will then be in the past. But for me, it's in the future coming up. And we can't wait for our listeners to hear and to dive into A Voice Silenced, I just made that past tense, A Voice Silenced, A Voice Sings soon.
Yeah, super excited. I can't wait to hear it. I think it'll be really fun. And don't be scared of the singing stuff. It's not supposed to be for an opera singer. That's not the point, right? It's just the human contact of the actual voice. So I'm really excited to hear it.
There will be some humanity.
That's all good. It needs to be humanity. We don't need perfection, right? We don't need perfection. We need humanity.
Well, thanks again so much, Cherise.
It was so fun. It was my pleasure. Thank you for reaching out and giving me this experience.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Music Crush. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also support the podcast, read show notes, and learn more about FNMC by visiting www.flutenewmusicconsortium.com.